your pattern has the numbers 1, 2, 3 on one side. This is where your fabric's going to go. It also has a dark straight line, or a couple dark straight lines. This is where you're going to sew. And then it has a dash line. This is for your 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you decide to sew this block to other blocks, you're going to need that 1/4 inch seam allowance. For example, in this quilt, you see I've sewn 1, 2, 3, 4 of these rail fence blocks together, and in order to sew that together, I had to have the seam allowance. So the first thing you're going to do with your pattern is you're going to look at it and see that you're going to sew between fabric 1 and 2 on this dark line. Before I take this to the sewing machine, I like to fold on that line. This fold helps me, one, tear off the paper later because it weakens the fibers, and two, it helps me position fabric down the road. So the easiest way that I find to fold that is to take a card or a postcard and lay it down and just fold. So I've got that fold between 1 and 2. If I want to, I can fold it back, because every time I fold, that's weakening those fibers in that paper. It makes it much easier to tear that paper out down the road. So now I'm ready for my fabric. And if you look at this one, you see I have 1, 2, and 3. I have the 3 different fabrics. So the first one I'm going to pick up is fabric number 1. And this was a scrap. It was already cut in a strip. You don't have to cut strips, but I will say it makes it a little bit easier when I'm getting this fabric cut. So I'm going to take this fabric, going to lay it over number 1. Going to give me a little extra room here and a little room up there, and I'm going to cut it. Don't have to worry that it's nice and straight on the sides. Just the only thing I need to do is to make sure that this piece covers number 1, that it covers this black line, and that it makes it to the seam allowance line. So here we go, that piece covers, and so I've cut fabric number 1. Now I'm ready to cut fabric number 2. This is a pretty big piece, and so I'm going to cut out some of the bulk in it. You can rotary cut if you want to, but I'm just using a scissors. So let's take this piece I've cut, and I see, here's number 2, I see that this piece covers. If I want to cut it down, I can, but there's really no need to. So I've checked. It covers up to the dash line. On this side, it covers the dash line. On this side, on the bottom, it covers the dash line, and it goes over this black line. So that piece is going to be sufficient to use. So now I'm ready to position my fabric. My fabric goes on the back of the pattern, which is why paper piecing is confusing sometimes. I'm going to tilt this a little, and hopefully you're going to be able to see those lines. If you hold it up to the sun or to a light, you can usually see through the pattern. So here's number 1. I'm going to take my fabric number 1. The first fabric on paper piecing patterns always goes face up, right over the top of the number 1. So this is my first piece of fabric. It's going to go face up. I need to make sure that it's covering number 1. I'm going to turn this over, hold it up to the light. You can see that the fabric goes up to the dash line, down here at the bottom of the dash line, and you see that there's extra on both of these solid lines. So I'm ready to pin that. I'm going to pin that in place. Let's turn this around, get the numbers right. So here we have 1, 2, and 3. So fabric number 2 is going to go here, but I don't put it on the numbered side. I have to turn it over. It's going to go on the back side. So number 2 is right here where my finger is. So let's lay this down. This is how it's going to look when it's sewn. You're going to have 1, 2. Let me pull this one out. It's going to look like this. So I like to place the piece where it's going to go. And when I sew, traditionally, I put right sides together. So when I sew in paper piecing, I'm going to put right sides together. Number 1 is pinned. So I'm going to leave that there, and I'm going to flip number 2 over the top of number 1. I'm going to turn it to this side, and I'm going to pin. I'm going to take this pin out, and the place I'm going to pin is down this sewing line. Let's see, let's get it right on that sewing line. Oops. Okay, the reason why I want to pin there is I want to see what it's going to be like when I take it to my sewing machine. So if I sewed that line, will this piece of fabric be in the right place? And yes, it will. I've just pulled it back. Let's look on this side. It's going to cover up here. It's going to cover that side, and it's going to cover the bottom. So I can take this to my sewing machine and sew it. Before, however, I take it over there, I want to make sure that that this pin, I'd like to take it out, and I like to pin this way, just so I don't sew over the top of that long pin. So now I'm ready to go to the sewing machine.